At Easter brunch, my stepmom said, "Sit outside. This is for the inner circle." I'd catered the meal. I redirected the delivery truck, starving their exclusive gathering. I, 32M, never thought Easter brunch would be the hill I'd die on, but here we are. My father remarried 3 years ago. His new wife brought 2 daughters from her previous marriage, both in their 20s, both carbon copies of their mother's entitled attitude. I tried, really tried, to make things work. I showed up to family dinners, sent birthday cards, played nice at Thanksgiving. But there was always this invisible line I couldn't cross, this sense that I was being tolerated rather than included. The Easter gathering was supposed to be at their house, the sprawling colonial my father bought after selling the modest home where I grew up. My stepmom had made a big deal about hosting, sending out group texts about how special it was going to be, how she wanted everyone together for a proper family celebration. I'd offered to help with the food, figuring it might be a peace offering of sorts. She'd waved me off, saying she had it handled, that I should just show up and enjoy myself. 2 weeks before Easter, she called me. Her voice had that syrupy quality she used when she wanted something. She explained that she'd been thinking about the menu, really wanted to do something impressive this year, something that would wow everyone. The problem was she'd bitten off more than she could chew with the planning. Would I consider helping arrange the catering? She knew I had connections in the restaurant industry through my job in event management. I should have seen it coming. I should have known that any request from her came with strings attached. But I wanted to believe that maybe this was her extending an olive branch, that maybe she actually valued my contribution to the family. So I said yes. I spent hours researching caterers, getting quotes, coordinating menus. My stepmom was particular, changing her mind every other day about what she wanted. First it was traditional Easter fare, then she wanted something more contemporary, then back to traditional but elevated. I called in favors, negotiated prices, made sure every detail was perfect. We settled on a local catering company known for their upscale comfort food. The menu was impressive: herb-crusted lamb, roasted vegetables with balsamic glaze, scalloped potatoes, fresh rolls, 3 different salads, and an assortment of desserts that included a custom-made carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The bill came to just under $3,000. My stepmom had insisted on paying, though she'd complained about the cost more than once. I'd coordinated everything: the delivery time, the setup instructions, the serving dishes. The caterer knew to arrive at 11 in the morning, giving them time to set up before the 1 o'clock brunch. Easter Sunday morning, I drove over early. I'd told my stepmom I'd help with last-minute setup, arranging flowers, making sure the dining room looked perfect. When I arrived at 10:30, the house was already buzzing with activity. Her daughters were there with their boyfriends. Her sister had flown in from out of state, and several of her friends from her book club were milling around the kitchen. I walked in through the garage, expecting to find my father or at least be greeted with some acknowledgement. Instead, my stepmom barely glanced up from where she was arranging place cards at the dining room table. She told me the flowers were in the sunroom, and I should put them in vases. No hello, no thank you for everything I'd done. Just instructions. I found my father in his study, hunched over his laptop. He looked tired. He'd always looked tired since the remarriage, like the effort of keeping everyone happy was slowly draining him. We talked briefly about work, about the weather, about nothing important. He asked if I was looking forward to brunch, and I said I was, though the knot forming in my stomach suggested otherwise. By 11:15, I'd arranged the flowers, set out the good china my stepmom had specifically requested, and made sure the coffee station was ready. The house looked beautiful, ready for a magazine spread. I kept checking my phone, waiting for the text from the caterer confirming they'd arrived. Traffic shouldn't have been bad, but I wanted to make sure everything was on track. At 11:30, my stepmom called everyone into the dining room. I thought maybe she wanted to go over the schedule, make sure we were all on the same page about timing. Instead, she stood at the head of the table, her daughters flanking her like lieutenants, and announced that she needed to clarify the seating arrangements. She gestured to the formally set dining room, explaining that space was limited and she wanted to make sure the setup was elegant. Then she turned to me, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, and told me I'd be sitting outside on the patio. She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. The patio setup was lovely too, she assured me, and I'd still be part of the celebration, just in a more casual setting. I stood there, trying to process what she'd just said. I asked her why I couldn't sit inside with everyone else. She sighed, that exaggerated sigh she used when she thought someone was being difficult, and explained that the dining room was for the inner circle. Her daughters, their boyfriends, her sister, her friends, my father, they were the core family. I was welcome, of course, but the indoor seating was reserved for those closest to her. Something inside me went very cold. I looked at my father, waiting for him to say something, to tell her that was ridiculous, that I was his son. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then muttered something about it just being one meal, that maybe we could all rotate throughout the afternoon. My stepmom shook her head. The seating was final. She had place cards made. She'd thought this through. I excused myself, saying I needed to use the bathroom. My hands were shaking as I walked down the hallway, past family photos where I was conspicuously absent. I locked myself in the powder room and pulled out my phone. The caterer had texted 10 minutes earlier, saying they were 5 minutes away. I called them. The owner answered, cheerful and professional. I explained there had been a change of plans, that I needed to redirect the delivery. Could they take everything to my apartment instead? She seemed confused, asking if there was a problem with the original location. I told her it was complicated, a family situation, but that I'd make it worth her while if she could accommodate the change. She put me on hold. 2 minutes felt like an eternity. I could hear my stepmom's voice from the dining room, loud and bright, as she entertained her guests. She was laughing about something, probably already forgotten that she'd just relegated me to the kids' table equivalent of family dinners. The caterer came back on the line. She said it was unorthodox, but they could redirect. However, she needed confirmation about payment since the credit card on file was registered to the original address. I told her I'd cover the full cost myself if needed, that I'd meet them at my apartment and sort out payment there. She agreed. She'd text me when they were 15 minutes out. I splashed water on my face, straightened my shirt, and walked back out to the living room. My stepmom was showing her sister the new curtains she'd ordered. Her daughters were taking selfies by the fireplace. No one noticed me standing there. I found my father refilling his coffee. I told him I wasn't feeling well, that I thought I might be coming down with something and should probably head home. He looked relieved, which somehow made it worse. He told me to feel better, that we'd catch up soon. He didn't ask questions. He didn't insist I stay. He just patted my shoulder and went back to whatever task my stepmom had assigned him. I left through the front door, got in my car, and drove home. My phone buzzed with texts from my stepmom asking where the caterer was. I ignored them. By noon, I was at my apartment, watching through the window for the delivery truck. My phone was blowing up now. Multiple calls from my stepmom, then from her daughters, then finally from my father. I turned the ringer off. The truck pulled up at 12:20. I helped them unload everything, tipping them an extra $200 for the inconvenience. My small apartment suddenly smelled like an upscale restaurant. Trays of beautifully prepared food covered every surface in my kitchen. I sat down at my dining table, set out one plate, and served myself a modest portion of lamb and vegetables. Then I turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls. 23 text messages. The voicemails ranged from confused to angry to desperate. My stepmom's progression was almost comical. First asking where the food was, then demanding to know what happened, then claiming I'd sabotaged her event, then finally threatening legal action for theft. My father's messages were more subdued. He asked if I knew anything about the missing delivery. He said my stepmom was very upset. He wondered if maybe there had been a mix-up with the address. I ate my lunch slowly, savoring every bite. Then I typed out a single text to the family group chat. Sorry about the confusion with the catering. I redirected the delivery to my apartment since I'd be eating outside anyway. Didn't think the inner circle would miss it. Happy Easter. My phone immediately started ringing again. I declined every call. Over the next hour, the texts became increasingly frantic. My stepmom claimed they had nothing to eat, that she had a house full of guests and no food. Her daughters accused me of being petty and childish. My father asked me to please send the food back, that we could talk about whatever was bothering me, but this wasn't the way to handle it. I responded only once more. You had the seating arranged. I had the food arranged. Everyone got what they planned for. I spent the rest of Easter afternoon working my way through an impressive spread, boxing up leftovers, and ignoring my phone. By evening, the calls had stopped. The texts had dwindled to occasional messages from my father asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. Update 1. It's been 3 days since Easter, and the fallout has been more intense than I anticipated. My father showed up at my apartment Monday evening, unannounced. He looked worse than he had on Sunday, his face drawn and tired. He asked if we could talk, actually talk, not through text messages or phone calls. I let him in. We sat across from each other in my living room, the same seats where we used to watch football games back when I lived with him and my mother. He started by saying he understood I was upset, that the seating arrangement had been inappropriate. He acknowledged that my stepmom had handled things badly. But there's always a but. He said I'd embarrassed her in front of her family and friends. He said redirecting the catering was an extreme reaction, that it had caused significant problems. Apparently, they'd scrambled to order pizza and make whatever they could find in the pantry. My stepmom had been humiliated, her daughters were furious, and her sister had left early because of the tension. I asked him if he'd spoken to her about relegating me to patio seating before it happened. He admitted he'd known she was planning some kind of separate seating arrangement, but he'd thought it was just about space constraints. He hadn't realized she was going to frame it the way she did, this whole inner circle thing. I pointed out that he'd watched it happen and said nothing. He'd chosen to keep the peace with her instead of standing up for his own son. He didn't argue with that. He just sat there, looking defeated. He asked what I wanted from him, what would make this right. I told him I wanted him to acknowledge that I'd been treated like an outsider in what was supposed to be my family, that I'd spent weeks arranging a meal I was then told I wasn't good enough to share. I told him I wanted him to stop letting her rewrite our family dynamic to erase me. He said he'd talk to her, that they'd work on making me feel more included. I told him that wasn't enough, that actions mattered more than promises. I said I'd be happy to have a relationship with him, but I was done pretending to be part of a family that didn't want me there. He left after an hour, promising to call me later in the week. I haven't heard from him since. My stepmom, on the other hand, has been relentless. She sent me a bill for the catering, claiming I owe her the $3,000 since I took the food. I forwarded her the receipt showing I'd paid for it myself once I redirected it. She then claimed I'd stolen her concept and menu planning. I didn't respond to that. Her daughters have been posting vague messages on social media about toxic family members and people who can't handle honest communication. I haven't engaged. Update 2. 2 weeks after Easter, things have shifted in ways I didn't expect. My father called and asked if I'd meet him for coffee, just the two of us. We met at a place near my office, neutral territory. He looked different, somehow lighter than he had at my apartment. He told me he'd had several conversations with my stepmom about what happened. He'd asked her directly why she'd set up the seating the way she had, why she'd felt the need to exclude me. According to him, she'd initially denied that it was exclusionary, claiming it was just about space. But when he pressed her, she'd admitted that she felt I'd never fully accepted her or her daughters, that she thought creating a closer-knit group would help strengthen the family bonds. I pointed out the obvious flaw in that logic. She tried to strengthen family bonds by explicitly telling me I wasn't part of the inner family. He acknowledged it didn't make sense. Then he surprised me. He said he'd told her that if she couldn't treat me as an equal member of the family, he couldn't continue to enable that dynamic. He'd given her an ultimatum, family therapy, all of us together, or he'd start spending family occasions separately with me. I didn't know what to say. I'd expected him to smooth things over, to find some middle ground that wouldn't upset anyone. Instead, he'd actually taken a stand. I asked him what her response had been. He said she'd been angry at first, accusing him of choosing me over her. But after a few days of tension, she'd agreed to try therapy. Her daughters were resistant, but she'd insisted they participate if they wanted to continue living in the house rent-free. I told him I'd think about it. I wasn't sure I wanted to sit in a room with people who'd made it clear they saw me as peripheral, listening to a therapist try to force bonding. But I appreciated that he was finally addressing the problem instead of ignoring it. 2 days after that conversation, my stepmom texted me directly. She apologized for the seating arrangement, saying she'd been trying to create something special for her side of the family and hadn't considered how it would feel from my perspective. She acknowledged that she'd handled it badly. It wasn't a perfect apology. It still framed the problem as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate slight. But it was more than I'd expected from her. I responded simply, I appreciate you reaching out. I'm willing to work on this if everyone else is. The therapy session started 3 weeks after Easter. We've had 2 so far. They're awkward and tense, but things are being said that needed to be said. The therapist has been good at calling out patterns I hadn't even fully recognized. The way my stepmom's daughters dominate conversations, The way my father tends to withdraw rather than engage in conflict. The way I've been keeping score of every slight to justify my distance. At the second session, my stepmom's older daughter admitted that she'd resented me from the beginning because she'd seen me as competition for her mother's attention. She'd thought if she and her sister could become my father's primary focus, their mother would be happier. It was twisted logic, but hearing her say it out loud made something click into place. I admitted that I'd catered the Easter brunch partially because I wanted to prove I was valuable to the family, that I could contribute something meaningful. When I'd been excluded from the table, it had confirmed my worst fear, that no matter what I did, I'd never be good enough. We're not one big happy family now. We're not even close. But we're talking, really talking, for the first time since my father remarried. Update 3. It's been 2 months since Easter, and I'm writing this final update because people have been asking how things turned out. The therapy has continued. We're meeting every other week now instead of weekly, which the therapist says is progress. The sessions are still sometimes difficult, but they've become less about assigning blame and more about understanding each other's perspectives. My stepmom and I had coffee alone last week, her suggestion. She told me that the Easter incident had been a wake-up call for her, that she'd been so focused on creating her ideal family that she hadn't noticed she was excluding someone who was already family. She admitted that she'd felt insecure about my relationship with my father, worried that he'd always love me more than her daughters, and she'd overcompensated by trying to build a separate inner circle where she had control. I told her I'd never wanted to compete with her daughters for my father's attention. I just wanted to maintain the relationship I'd always had with him. She said she understood that now. We're planning a do-over family dinner next month. No assigned seating, no inner circles. Just everyone at one table, sharing a meal. My father is cooking, insisting that we keep it simple and focused on being together rather than impressing anyone. I've also set some boundaries. I told my father and stepmom that I need them to check with me before volunteering me for family projects, that I'm happy to help, but not to be voluntold and then excluded. They agreed. As for the catered Easter meal, it became something of a legendary story among my friends. I hosted a belated Easter dinner the following weekend and invited the people who've always treated me like family, my college roommates, a few coworkers, my ex-girlfriend who somehow remained one of my closest friends. We worked our way through the leftovers and laughed about the absurdity of the whole situation. Someone asked if I regretted redirecting the truck, if I wished I'd handled it differently. I thought about it, really thought about it. I said no. Sometimes people need to feel the consequence of their actions to understand the impact. My stepmom needed to sit at that beautiful table with her inner circle and realize that by excluding me, she'd excluded the person who'd made the whole meal possible. The question I've had to ask myself is whether what I did was revenge or justice. I think it was both. It was revenge in the sense that I wanted them to feel a fraction of the exclusion I'd felt. But it was justice in the sense that I'd organized and paid for a meal, and I had every right to decide where it went. Would I do it again? Probably not. There were more mature ways to handle the situation. But I also don't think I'd have gotten through to them any other way. Sometimes you have to make a dramatic statement to be heard. My relationship with my father is slowly improving. We've started having lunch every couple of weeks, just the two of us, and it feels like we're rebuilding something that had been eroding. He's been more present, asking questions about my life, sharing things about his own struggles. My relationship with my stepmom and her daughters is still a work in progress. We're cordial, sometimes even friendly, but there's an understanding that trust takes time to build. They invite me to things now, genuinely invite me, and I go when I can. It's not perfect, but it's better. The bigger lesson I've learned is that family, biological or otherwise, requires effort from everyone involved. You can't build relationships on the assumption that blood or marriage certificates are enough. You have to actively make space for people, include them, value them. And when you fail to do that, you can't be surprised when they stop trying to fit into spaces where they're not wanted. That Easter brunch could have been a beautiful family moment. Instead, it became a turning point, a line in the sand that forced everyone to confront what we'd been avoiding. In a strange way, I'm grateful for it. Sometimes things have to break before they can be fixed properly. I'll never forget the look on my stepmom's face when she called me in those first frantic hours, realizing that her perfect brunch had been derailed. But I also won't forget the look on my father's face when he showed up at my apartment and finally admitted that he'd failed to protect my place in our family. Both moments mattered. Both were necessary. So here I am, 2 months later, sitting in my apartment with an empty dining table and a complicated but improving relationship with my family. The catering truck is long gone, the food eaten, the Easter decorations packed away. What remains is the understanding that I'm done being an afterthought, done sitting at the kids' table while others decide my worth. If there's a moral to this story, it's this: know your value, and don't let anyone convince you to accept less than you deserve. Even if that means redirecting the truck and eating $3,000 of Easter brunch by yourself. Especially if it means that. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.